Who decided whether a king would go to war? The people? The army? The philosophers? Sometimes, a frightened goat. 5th century BC. Ancient Greece is suffocating. A plague spreads through the cities. Harvests fail. Wars are approaching the borders. The same civilization that taught the world logic, geometry, and medicine suddenly finds itself powerless. When reason offers no answers, people turn to something older. To the gods. And there is one place where, according to the Greeks, the gods still speak directly to humans. A place they called the navel of the world. Delphi. For centuries, this mountain sanctuary was not just a temple. It was the decision-making center of the Greek world. Before wars. Before colonization. Before betrayals and alliances. Kings, generals, tyrants, and envoys all came here for one thing, a voice. Not written. Not debated. Spoken. But here is the paradox. Apollo, the god of reason, harmony, and light, never spoke himself. His voice came through a woman, shaking, convulsing, barely conscious. And sometimes, before she even opened her mouth, the fate of entire kingdoms depended on a goat. Because if the animal did not tremble when cold water was poured over it, the ritual was cancelled. No prophecy. No divine answer. Imagine that for a moment. An army waits. A war is coming. And the future depends on whether a terrified animal shivers. This is not a metaphor. This is how power worked in ancient Greece. And now the real question begins. Was it truly the voice of a god that ruled the ancient world? Or something far more human? To understand the power of Delphi, we must step inside the temple itself. The air is cool. The light is dim. Stone statues emerge from the shadows, watching in silence. At the center of the sanctuary lies a crack in the rock. Ancient authors described it as an opening into the underworld. From it, they said, rose the sacred breath of Apollo. For them, divine presence. For us, something else. Modern geological studies show that Delphi sits on the intersection of two fault lines. Gases could seep upward through the rock, including ethylene, a substance that induces euphoria, hallucinations, and trance-like states. Modern geological studies show that Delphi sits on the intersection of two fault lines. Gases could seep upward through the rock, including ethylene, a substance that induces euphoria, hallucinations, and trance-like states. One prevailing theory among modern scholars suggests that these trance-like states may have been induced by naturally occurring gases rising from the earth beneath the temple. In small doses, ethylene creates a sense of revelation. In larger ones, confusion, convulsions, and loss of control. In small doses, ethylene creates a sense of revelation. In larger ones, confusion, convulsions, and loss of control. Now imagine the ritual. A woman, usually older, often from a modest background, is led to the crack. She has fasted. She has bathed in the sacred spring. She chews laurel leaves, believed to belong to Apollo. She sits on a tripod directly above the fissure. At first, nothing happens. Then her breathing deepens. Her hands begin to tremble. Her body stiffens. Ancient witnesses wrote that her voice changed completely. From human speech to something closer to an animal's cry. Some described it as roaring. Others as incoherent screams. There is one detail that rarely appears in popular retellings, and it is deeply unsettling. Ancient sources suggest that not every prophecy required a full trance. On days when the sanctuary was overwhelmed with visitors, when delegations from multiple city-states waited outside, the ritual was sometimes shortened. The priestess would still sit on the tripod, still perform the gestures, still invoke Apollo. But the violent convulsions did not always come. In those moments, the words attributed to the god were delivered with little or no trance at all, shaped primarily by the priests who stood beside her. To the crowd, the difference was invisible. The ritual looked the same. The authority sounded the same. And the answers carried the same divine weight. Whether the god had truly arrived was no longer the point. The system moved forward regardless. This was the moment the Greeks believed the god had arrived. Flutes and drums filled the chamber, intensifying the rhythm. The sound did not calm the priestess, it pushed her deeper. For the crowd outside, this was sacred proof. For modern observers, it looks disturbingly close to ritualized poisoning. And it came at a price. Many Pythias served only a few years. Some collapsed during prophecies. Others died young, their bodies destroyed by repeated exposure. Serving Apollo was not an honor that lasted a lifetime. It was often a slow sacrifice. And yet, when her hoarse voice finally broke the silence, kings fell to their knees. Because even a single syllable could mean war, or annihilation. At this point, the illusion begins to fracture. One crucial detail is often overlooked when we talk about the Delphic oracle. The Pythia did not speak in clear, coherent sentences. Ancient authors describe her speech as broken, uneven, and frequently incomprehensible. What came from her mouth sounded less like language and more like raw, uncontrolled sound. Cries, fragments of words, sudden pauses. Breath torn apart by trance. This meant that the divine message, as the Greeks understood it, was never heard directly by those who came seeking answers. It had to be interpreted, shaped, and translated into something meaningful. That responsibility belonged to the priests who stood beside the tripod. They listened carefully, extracting sense from chaos. A hesitation could become a warning. A phrase could be turned into a command. Meaning was not received whole, it was assembled step by step. Plutarch, one of our most important sources on Delphi, knew this process from within. He was not only a philosopher and historian, but also a priest of Apollo himself. In his writings, he openly admits that the gods spoke in riddles, and that humans completed the meaning according to their own understanding. This gave the priests extraordinary influence. Two cities could ask similar questions and receive answers that led them in entirely different directions. One prophecy might encourage caution and restraint, while another, phrased only slightly differently, could justify war. Both would be presented as equally divine. Archaeology confirms how much was at stake. Delphi was overflowing with wealth. Treasuries built by city-states lined the sanctuary. Golden tripods, bronze armor, and monumental statues filled the sacred space. The oracle was not only a religious center, it was also one of the richest financial hubs of the Greek world. In practice, this made Delphi a place where religion, politics, and economics merged. The future was not simply foretold there, it was negotiated. Gifts spoke alongside prayers, and influence often determined how the riddles were framed. Once the priests delivered their interpretation, no one dared to challenge it. To question the meaning of a prophecy was to question Apollo himself. Fear sealed the authority of the words spoken in the temple. This is how ambiguity became power. The voice from the abyss, whether divine or human, ruled not because it was clear, but because it could not be argued with. The influence of Delphi was not symbolic. It was practical, direct, and deeply woven into the political life of the ancient world. The words spoken in this sanctuary did not remain within the temple walls. They traveled with armies, shaped alliances, and justified decisions whose consequences lasted for generations. One of the most famous examples comes from Herodotus. Croesus, king of Lydia, was among the wealthiest rulers of his time. When the Persian Empire began to rise, he turned to Delphi for guidance before launching a military campaign. The oracle answered with a phrase that seemed reassuring. "If you cross the river, you will destroy a great kingdom." Croesus interpreted this as a promise of victory. Confident in the divine message, he marched his army across the river Halys. The result was catastrophic. The great kingdom that fell was his own. The prophecy had not lied. It had simply left enough room for fatal misunderstanding. This pattern appears again and again in the history of Delphi. Decades later, Greece faced a threat far greater than any single kingdom. The Persian invasion placed the survival of Greek civilization itself in doubt. Once more, Athens turned to the oracle. The response was cryptic and unsettling. "Salvation will come through wooden walls." The meaning was unclear. Some Athenians believed it referred to defensive fortifications. Others fled the city altogether. Only one interpretation proved decisive. Themistocles argued that the wooden walls meant ships. He convinced Athens to trust in its fleet. The naval victory at Salamis followed. Greece survived. And later generations would remember Delphi not as a place of confusion, but as a source of salvation. The same oracle. The same ambiguity. Completely different outcomes. Delphi's authority extended beyond individual battles. Before the Peloponnesian War, the oracle openly favored Sparta. Its words reinforced existing tensions and lent divine legitimacy to hostility between Greek city-states. The conflict that followed became the most devastating civil war in Greek history, weakening the entire region for decades. Even figures who seemed unstoppable sought the oracle's approval. Alexander of Macedon visited Delphi before beginning his campaigns of conquest. According to later accounts, when the priestess initially refused to prophesy on an inauspicious day, Alexander dragged her toward the tripod. In fear or trance, she cried out that he was invincible. Alexander accepted this not as hysteria, but as confirmation of destiny. These moments revealed the true nature of Delphi's power. It did not command armies or raise walls. It shaped belief. And belief, once established, guided actions more effectively than force. A few fractured words, interpreted as divine will, were enough to send kings to war, to justify destruction, or to convince entire populations that history itself was unfolding according to plan. In this way, the voice from the abyss became one of the most influential forces in the ancient world, not because it was precise, but because it was believed. By the time the oracle reached its peak, Delphi was no longer just a place of consultation. It had become a spectacle. On major prophetic days, the roads leading to the sanctuary filled with people. Kings and generals arrived with entourages. Envoys carried official questions sealed with wax. Ordinary pilgrims came simply to witness the moment when the god would speak. The square before the temple vibrated with sound. Drums set the rhythm. Flutes stretched long, piercing notes into the mountain air. Torches flickered even in daylight, their smoke mixing with incense. This was not quiet worship. It was a carefully staged atmosphere of anticipation. Ancient descriptions suggest that the ritual was designed to overwhelm the senses. Noise, movement, smell, and expectation worked together. Long before the Pythia entered her trance, the crowd was already emotionally primed. Inside the temple, the ritual followed a strict order. The goat was brought forward and sprinkled with cold water. If it shuddered, the god was considered present. Only then could the Pythia be led to the tripod. A single physical reaction, a tremor, opened the door to divine speech. Outside, thousands waited. Some prayed aloud. Others wept. Many simply stood frozen, afraid to speak. When the first hoarse sounds echoed from within the temple, the reaction was immediate. People fell to their knees. Faces were covered. Cries rose from the crowd. For them, this was not hysteria, it was proof. Apollo was here. But the ritual had a cost, and it was paid by the body of the priestess. Ancient sources record moments when the trance went too far. The Pythia's body would convulse uncontrollably. Her breathing became irregular. Sometimes she collapsed before the prophecy was complete. There is another detail that ancient writers mention quietly, almost in passing, but its implications are severe. In earlier centuries, the role of the Pythia was often held for life. But over time, this changed. By the later period, priestesses were replaced more frequently. Some served only a few years before their health deteriorated. Ancient accounts speak of voices permanently damaged, bodies weakened, and minds left unstable after repeated trances. The role was no longer something a human body could sustain for decades. What had once been interpreted as divine endurance began to look like physical breakdown. The god's voice did not grow stronger with time. The women who carried it simply did not survive it as long. In rare but documented cases, she did not rise again. For modern observers, this looks like a ritual that repeatedly subjected the human body to extreme physical stress. Repeated exposure to intoxicating gases, intense fasting, physical exhaustion, and psychological stress pushed the human body beyond its limits. For the ancient Greeks, however, such deaths were not scandals. They were signs. A priestess who died during prophecy was believed to have been taken fully by the god. Her death confirmed the authenticity of the ritual rather than calling it into question. Sources describe crowds responding not with horror, but with reverence, even admiration. In this environment, doubt had no place. To question the oracle was not merely to disagree. It was to separate oneself from the collective experience, from the moment, from the god. This is how mass religious drama worked in antiquity. Not through quiet faith, but through emotional immersion. The individual dissolved into the crowd, and the crowd surrendered to the voice from the abyss. And once that surrender was complete, the oracle no longer needed force. Belief did the work. Nothing that holds power forever remains unchanged. Not even a voice believed to come from the gods. By the late 4th and 3rd centuries BC, something subtle began to shift. Delphi still stood on the slopes of Parnassus. The rituals continued. The tripod remained in place. But the center of gravity of the ancient world was moving. Greece was no longer the unquestioned heart of civilization. Macedonian kings rose. Then Rome followed. The world expanded, and with it came new forms of authority. Roads replaced oracles. Laws replaced riddles. Armies answered to commanders, not prophecies. Delphi did not disappear overnight. It lingered. Roman elites continued to visit the sanctuary, but their attitude was different. For many of them, the oracle was no longer a source of guidance. It was a symbol, a relic of a venerable past. An exotic tradition worth witnessing, not obeying. The tone of the prophecies changed. Ancient writers note that the responses grew increasingly vague, repetitive, and uninspired. The trances became more dangerous. Priestesses fell ill more often. Some died young, their bodies weakened by repeated exposure to the fumes rising from the earth. What had once been interpreted as divine ecstasy now looked uncomfortably like physical collapse. Plutarch himself, writing during the Roman period, acknowledges this decline. He notes long intervals when no prophecies were delivered at all. Sometimes the oracle simply fell silent. The god, it seemed, was no longer eager to speak. This silence mattered. Because Delphi's power depended not on force, but on relevance. When rulers stopped waiting for its answers, the voice from the abyss lost its authority. Decisions were no longer made in dark chambers filled with smoke. They were made in marble halls, written into law, enforced by imperial administration. Rome had no need for riddles. And then came the final break. In the late 4th century AD, Emperor Theodosius I issued a series of decrees banning pagan cults throughout the empire. Temples were closed. Rituals were forbidden. The Delphic oracle was officially shut down. According to later chroniclers, the sanctuary delivered a final message before falling silent forever. The echo has faded. The temple is destroyed. The voice no longer speaks. Whether this prophecy was real or composed after the fact hardly matters. What matters is how it was remembered, as a confession of absence. As if the god himself had withdrawn. The crack remained. The mountain remained. But the voice was gone. When the oracle fell silent, the world did not collapse. No earthquakes followed. No divine punishment descended from the sky. Life simply moved on. The sacred crack on the slopes of Parnassus slowly filled with dust and weeds. The tripod was overturned. The temple stood empty. Wind passed between the columns where once thousands had waited in fear and hope. And yet, something remained. For centuries, people whispered that on certain nights, strange sounds could still be heard in the mountains. A hoarse echo carried by the wind. A voice that seemed to rise from below the earth. The voice that once decided the fate of kings. Ancient Greece is often remembered as a world of light. Marble temples glowing in the sun. Philosophers debating in the agora. Geometry, theater, sculpture, the foundations of Western reason. But that is only half of the picture. At night, the same civilization listened to something very different. In dark sanctuaries, to the sound of drums and broken breath, decisions were made not through argument, but through submission. Empires marched to war because a woman in convulsions uttered a few fractured words. Logic and fear existed side by side. The Parthenon was built in a world where kings waited for the oracle. Plato wrote in a society that still believed history could be guided by a voice from the abyss. This is the contradiction at the heart of antiquity. And it raises an uncomfortable question. Was Delphi truly a relic of a superstitious past, or a mirror held up to human nature itself? Because the oracle did not rule through force. It ruled through belief, through ambiguity, through the human need for certainty when reason reaches its limits. And that need did not disappear when the temple closed. It changed its form. Today, we no longer climb the slopes of Parnassus. We do not wait for goats to tremble or inhale sacred fumes. But we still listen for voices that promise clarity. Experts, screens, algorithms, figures we elevate above doubt. The temples are different now. The rituals are quieter. The language sounds more rational. But the question remains the same. When the future feels uncertain, whose voice do we choose to obey? Perhaps the Oracle of Delphi never truly vanished. Perhaps it simply learned to speak in a new way.